This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. We are days away before it all goes down. NBA restart, reorg, the re-up. Special shout-outs to our peoples, the Clips, baby. The re-up gang. That's what's going to be happening. Gang play taking place, man, at the end of this week, man. And it's just exciting right now that we know that the NBA is going to be at high, full gear, full throttle, no holes barred, all for us to be able to see who is going to hoist this trophy by the fall of 2020. It's just an exciting time, man. And as always, you know, I don't know too many people in my lifetime that I want to be in this situation or circumstance with better than having my right-hand man, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my man, Mr. Warren Shaw. What's good, my man? Hey, shake a leg, baby. We got some basketball to talk about.
Finally. You know what I mean? If like doing the
I should
rock
play the Rock's music in there, too.
Finally, the Rock has come back.
It's about that time.
Home.
And, you know, it's great that the NBA has figured out a way to return. Not too sure what the other sports are going to be looking like, you know, in a few weeks here, but NBA and the WNBA bubbling up, and it looks like it's going to be, you know, all systems go. WNBA actually started, you know, a couple of days before we recorded this show, so shouts to them. You know, great opening weekend in general. But as you alluded to, man, we have a lot to discuss this week's show. We are breaking down the Eastern Conference restart, you know, so with 22 teams going in, no way we could just throw that all into one episode. So we found a great guest to help us break down the Eastern Conference. So as always, man, let's get right to it.
Absolutely. And we didn't have to go too far, man. He has been on our show previously before, dropping knowledge, dropping dimes. But if you do catch him on Twitter, be careful, because you don't want to be on his bad side, not with his Twitter handle. We got our man, Nekias Duncan, joining on board with us to help talk about the Eastern Conference. But on Twitter, he's known as Karen in Paris. So if you don't like what he has to say about the Eastern Conference, don't be that guy for him to be that Karen. Okay? But as always, man, we appreciate you and yours for hopping on board with us this week. As always, get at my man Shaw, at Shaw Sports NBA, or get at me at GameFaceLee, the show's Twitter handle, at NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. Look for the Baseline NBA podcast. Add us to your playlist and allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all things happening in the association. Hey, man, we know how big it is to be covering all 22 teams that are going to be participating in this NBA restart. So, of course, we can't just do it in one episode. We got to do it in two. And we couldn't find a better partner to be able to jump on to talk about the Eastern Conference than our man, Nekias Duncan. And we are just excited to have him on board in the next few moments. So, as always, we appreciate you guys for hopping on board and hanging with the Baseline NBA podcast, especially through these times of the pandemic. We really hope that a lot of the stuff we've rolled out to you has piqued your interest, has piqued your earlobes, and you'll continue to support us. And the best way to do that is look for our podcast, add us, you know, not just to the playlist, but also give us your comments, your thoughts, give us a good rating. You know, we believe that great content deserves great ratings, and for us to keep doing it, you know, we need your help in that effort. So please, by all means, locate us and add us on. Now, let's get right down to the nitty gritty. You know how we do. You know how we roll. Let's get this thing started here on The Breakdown.
Time to break it
Down to the bone gristle.
And with us to discuss really what's going to be an unprecedented week where the NBA was going to basically take center stage amongst the landscape of sports. And we are so honored and privileged to be able to have an individual who is, you know, always has kept his ears to the ground and everything that's going on with the NBA. You know, he has been a featured voice on 5 Reasons Sports, Miami Heat Beat, Bleacher Report, SB Nation NBA, Dime Up Rocks, you name it. He's been on it. He talks about it. He lives it. Our man, Nekias Duncan. Nekias, thanks for hopping on board with us to really kickstart our heavy anticipation for the NBA restart.
Oh, no problem, man. Feeling pretty good after that introduction.
Well, we got a lot more lined up for you if we continue to trend in that direction. So let's get right into it, Nekias. You know, one of the things that I think has really been out in front about the eagerness for the NBA to be able to restart the season, as everybody's been clamoring, for basketball to be back on the screen again, to see the guys out there doing their thing. But before we do that, we just wanted to kind of get your perspective about how important it is for the NBA to be restarting, for them to finish this season, especially not just with the health crisis issues that the nation is going through, but also with everything else that's been going around as well too, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the advocacy of the players and involvement to help move the ball forward with activism. What are your thoughts about this? And do you see a way forward where there is a healthy balance for these guys to be able to continue to play at the level that we probably are going to expect them to play, while still having all of these issues ongoing as we continue in the months ahead?
I would say from a financial standpoint, it's incredibly important for the NBA to restart. They were sliding to lose over $1 billion in revenue if they had to cancel the whole thing. So with that being a fact, I always knew that the NBA was going to do whatever it could to get back. I haven't necessarily agreed with that just because of the pandemic that we're dealing with, as well as the protesting going around countrywide, and how that affects many players across the league. The league is predominantly black. So the Black Lives Matter movement hits home for, I would imagine, all of them, really. So it's been kind of a moral conflict on that front, because while I love basketball, and as someone, as you mentioned it up top, that writes for a lot of different sites, like, there's investment there for me to want basketball back. But also there are more important things that need to be dealt with, I feel like. And I think, especially at the height of the protesting that was going on in like Minnesota and Atlanta specifically, I just didn't want there to be a distraction with basketball. But money talks, and there was going to be a restart. So within that lens, I think the NBA has done a great job of making it as healthy as possible. The bubble idea was very well thought out, very thorough. And so far, there have been no positive tests. They've levied down the hammer on Bruno Caboclo, Rashawn Holmes, when they broke the bubble. We just had the Lou Will situation. He's going to be quarantined for 10 days. So I think the NBA has done a great job of fostering at least a healthy idea. Moving forward, I would say that I don't know how they could strike the balance between high-level basketball and social justice issues. Mm-hmm. Because I think they kind of stuck out an olive branch with the idea of putting different phrases on the back of jerseys.
Right.
But once we got a little bit more into it, there were only a select few phrases that the players could even choose from. And that rubbed a lot of players the wrong way, including LeBron, which is why he, Anthony Davis, and others have just decided to keep their last names on their jerseys. If they didn't have the choice to put whatever they want to put on it, then there really wasn't a point of it, I feel like. So I think it's going to be more for the NBA to put their money where their mouth is, donate to different different organizations, more so than trying to giving the players a platform to speak. LeBron has done that in post-game interviews. Jeremy Grant has done so. Bam Adebayo has done so. Tobias Harris has done so. Jaylen Brown has done so. Plenty of other players have spoken out. So I think the NBA needs to continue giving those guys room to spread their messages, and also backing up and really giving those guys freedom to express themselves when it comes down to it.
So it seems like, in essence, you're with us. Don't really feel like there's a need for them to come back, but they're more or less doing the best they possibly can. As you just kind of take the landscape of all the different sports out there, do you feel that the NBA and the WNBA probably have the best chance to kind of address all the issues that are out there right now?
Yeah, I think so. The WNBA in particular, they've been on the front lines of sports leagues speaking out on social injustices forever. They just really haven't gotten the credit that they've deserved on that front. So they've continued to do that as they started back up yesterday, their regular season. Players spoke out before games. They've been doing so. Same with the NBA players in pre and post practice interviews. They've been speaking out. There was a clip from yesterday, one of the games. The players had a brief demonstration where they walked off the court as the national anthem was being played, as opposed to the kneeling that we've seen in other sports. So they've been on the front lines of this thing. The NBA has also they've done a fine job. It hasn't been perfect by any means, but they've done a fine job. And I do think that the WNBA and NBA, in comparison to the other sports leagues, are a lot more liberal in their front, letting their players express themselves. I'm not sure how much room the MLB has to do that, considering their consumer base. I'm not sure. The NFL has never been good on that front, just to be frank about it. So,
yeah. We're with you on that one right there, too, as well. They're still learning.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's why I was proud of like Patrick Mahomes in particular, when he kind of forced the NFL's hand in letting players speak out when him and a few other star players came together with that video about the Black Lives Matter movement.
I want to follow up on something real quick. I know we obviously have you on here to really get your perspective regarding the Eastern Conference restart. But before we move to that, you bring up a lot of quality points. And I think the thing that stands out to me more than anything is the perception that the NBA, and we can use the WNBA in this context as saying that the players and the organization and the league itself are more liberal, or allow the players to be a little bit more liberal in their approach to advocate for social justice issues and for activism. But the word that I tend to speak on cautiously with these leagues is progressive or progressivism, right? And there has to be a fine line in our ability to say, yes, these leagues are giving the players a platform, but are they allowing them the ability to help make things progressive? And it's not a question of being conservative or being progressive in the political context. It's about seeing that there's progress being made. So it's not just saying that the logo is meaning that they are about it. It's also in what you just said earlier, where they are funding certain efforts. They are loudly promoting the advocacy for their players to speak on these things because it matters to them and their well-being of how they play the game, how they carry themselves through the game is indicative of how the league supports them in these efforts. If it's about social change, do you see it in that same kind of context, or would you like to see more of that in that context?
Oh, absolutely. And I think with the jersey thing in particular, it kind of shed light on the NBA being more liberal than the other sports leagues, but not being progressive.
Right.
Period.
Okay.
And I think that's an important distinction to make. The NBA has done a great job in comparison to the other sports leagues, but I don't think collectively we do a good job of separating the fact that they do a good job compared to the other sports leagues, and not just they do a good job, because there is room for improvement on and off the floor for the NBA in that regard. And I think the jersey thing was a key example of that, just giving the players an inch, but not really letting them take it a mile. So I think there's definitely room for them to progress there. And I think having stars like LeBron James, who are the face of the sport, and they care about those things, it's kind of similar to the Patrick Mahomes thing, is going to force the NBA's hand a bit. And I think that's going to be a good thing moving forward.
Nekias Duncan joining us here on the Baseline NBA podcast as we are getting ourselves geared up for the upcoming NBA restart. And he's going to help us break down the Eastern Conference. And I'm going to pass the ball forward to my man Shaw, because I know he is chomping at the bit, ready to throw out some heavy, hard-hitting questions for our man Nekias.
On a hard-hitting they'll be, but at the end of the day, I think, for us to kind of get into the actual basketball conversation here a little bit now, in the Eastern Conference specifically, we know you follow a team, pretty closely, and we'll get to them in a little bit. But what of the 9 teams returning in the Eastern Conference, which individual player you think has the most to gain or lose? Like what storyline from an individual player are you most looking forward to seeing coming out of this restart in Orlando?
It is probably going to be a boring answer, but I don't see how, if you're limited to the Eastern Conference, I'm not sure how the answer isn't Giannis, because at the time that the season started, he was, I would say, the easy favorite, not only for MVP, but also Defensive Player of the Year. And he's been headlining a Bucks team that hasn't been just great. They have been historically so. They have one of the best scoring margins in NBA history. They have the best defense in the league by 3 or 4 points per possession, which is absurd. Their offense has been great. They've lost Malcolm Brogdon, and they basically collectively replaced them with a guy like George Hill, Dante DiVincenzo stepping into those roles. But it all starts with Giannis. He is the engine on both ends of the floor for Milwaukee. And it's huge, because Milwaukee has a chance to kind of avenge their out last year in the East Conference Finals against the Toronto Raptors. They want to seek revenge there, try to get to the NBA Finals for the first time since, I want to say, 1971, which is quite a bit. And on top of that, Giannis is the prize free agent for next year's free agency period. And Milwaukee has to win, or at least come very close, I would imagine, for Giannis to feel comfortable locking down in Milwaukee for 5 years on the Supermax. So I think their run is the most important one to follow. It all starts with Giannis.
Well, it's clearly the most important for the New York Knicks fans to follow because, of course, if the Milwaukee Bucks don't win the championship, the New York Knicks must ready themselves for full embarrassment of believing that they're going to figure out a way to land Giannis Antetokounmpo in any kind of free agency chase because they always believe that they can get the big name guys, right? So maybe it's just best suited that the Knicks obviously sit out this restart and watch all of this go by because we're gearing ourselves up for another episode of As the Knicks Turn, right? So that's how that's playing. I think the Giannis storyline is such an intriguing storyline, Nekias, because of the fact that this is a team, by all accounts, if this was still within the Warriors Cavaliers dynastic looking glass, we would be trying to elevate the Bucks as serious contenders and a matter of just whether or not they should or shouldn't win the title. And yet we're still not taking them seriously enough because we still have to deal with two other teams on the other side of the conference that legitimately would be a threat to robbing Giannis and Bucks fans of an opportunity of a title since they had another giant amongst the shadows in Lou Alcindor. So, it's funny to me that we're not even giving these guys legitimate credit as being a viable perennial championship contender given what they've improved upon after what they lost in this past offseason.
Yeah, one, that's a portion of them being a small market. Like the Bucks, no matter how good they do, are probably never going to get as much attention as either of the LA teams, especially since both of them are really, really good. So that's a part of it. Also, I feel like the doubts surrounding the Bucks in general is about their supporting cast, and I feel like collectively people have kind of worked backwards on the Bucks. It's, hey, we're going to discredit them. We're going to discredit them. Giannis is cool, but we need to see it. We need to see it. We need to see it. And then the Bucks are really freaking good last year, and then they lose in the Eastern Conference Finals. And then see, Chris Middleton had a cold series. See, Eric Bledsoe disappeared again. See, this is why you don't trust the Bucks. Instead of acknowledging what they are, and then kind of analyzing from there. And I feel like there's a similar thing going on there. Even as Eric Bledsoe has returned to form, Chris Middleton has made the leap from All-Star to All-NBA as a second banana. Brook Lopez is probably going to get some Defensive Player of the Year votes as well. The role players have stepped up in the absence of a guy like Malcolm Brogdon. It is still kind of like wait-and-see mode because I don't think collectively people still trust the team beyond Giannis. And then Giannis has his own questions too. We look at the jumper. It is still very much a wild card for him. And that was at least part of why Milwaukee struggled to score late in their Eastern Conference series with the Raptors, because they just didn't have – once they walled off Giannis from the paint and the role players kind of folded behind him, he didn't have another counter. So I do think some of the criticism was warranted, but it feels like people have kind of worked backwards on how they view the ball.
There when it comes to Milwaukee, but we'll throw another name out there for y'all to kind of maybe chomp on here a little bit. And Cal's going to get at me a little bit because it's just kind of what Cal does when I talk the Sixers. But I think a guy who has a lot to prove is Joel Embiid. Going into the season, I remember when we spoke with you earlier.
I'm surprised you said Joel Embiid. But go ahead.
Earlier
Carry
this
on.
season, we had Nekias on, and we remember talking about the Eastern Conference, and he was, very prophetic in what Giannis was going to be able to do, et cetera, right? And I think for us, we also looked at, Embiid trying to maybe take that step up this year and at least be in the MVP conversation. Not to say that he's necessarily going to win it, but he needed to be there. And obviously the combination of him and Simmons needs to be elite if Philadelphia is going to have any chance at competing and potentially knocking Milwaukee off of their rocker to get to the NBA Finals. But what do you both think about the prospects of Joel Embiid being one of the guys who has the most to prove, or would you just go to his counterpart and say it's Ben Simmons instead?
Can I jump in on this one first, Nekias? I know you're the guest, and I always will kowtow to I'm basically saying I'm saving the best for last on this response, but I want to quickly jump in on this one because I want to take a different turn to what Shaw is saying regarding whether or not Joel Embiid should be looked at or focused upon so heavily, especially during this restart, because the storyline that I have for the Sixers is Simmons summoned. And part of the reason why I say that is because there's been much talk about how Ben Simmons, has really kind of reimagined himself coming into the bubble, and there is a different mindset with him, which I think is good, because if there's any chance for the Sixers to be taken seriously, even in this restart, it has to be one of these two guys have to be more than just what they've been giving us at some point. I don't know if whether or not Embiid is at that point yet. I've seen enough of a sample size in this season to say that he still has some work to do. And maybe this time off, I think, would actually hamper that. Because I feel like you got to constantly be on Joel Embiid for him to actually start taking this seriously. Like, it's not like Giannis, where you can just leave him alone on an island and he'll build a cruise ship to take him to wherever his destination is. But with Ben Simmons, I see more of that. If this is what he is doing in this off time during a pandemic with everything that's going on, you didn't see him make a lot of talk and noise with everything going on with Black Lives Matter movement. So I have to assume that part of his focus and attention is his ability to help get the Sixers somewhere in the conversation of an Eastern Conference Finals run. To me, I think this comes down to what version of Ben Simmons we're going to see in this bubble restart, because it can't be what these guys are giving us so far this year and what we've seen from last year to assume that they're going to be anywhere close. Nekias, you can jump in now and tell me if I'm completely off base on that point, or more so just emphasize to the point about what Shaw is saying regarding Joel Embiid.
I would probably lean more towards your point of view. I think both players obviously have the questions to be answered. For Joel Embiid, the big thing for him is always going to be health. But if he's on the court, then it becomes two things for me. A, is the jumper going? B, how is he handling double teams? And the second one is more so influenced by Ben Simmons' presence on the roster, which is why I do think Ben Simmons is the one that has the biggest question mark. Because with Joel Embiid, he's been effective. He's effective and he's impactful. Even when he kind of went cold during the Raptors series last year, the Sixers outscored the Raptors while he was on the court, and they just got bum rushed whenever he went to the bench. Just his very presence changes how teams shoot against Philadelphia. Their shot selection completely alters. People don't even go in the paint when Embiid's on the floor, and then that completely flips when he's off the court, because he's just one of the most terrifying rim protectors in the sport, and the Sixers don't have a comparable guy behind him, really. Al Horford is more of a mobile guy, shut you down on switches type dude, more so than a guy that can just lock down the paint for you. And then last year, the Sixers just didn't have a good backup center, so it looked worse. But we know Embiid is impactful. It's just a matter of how impactful is he. With Ben Simmons in a playoff setting, we don't know if he's impactful yet. A lot of that is roster construction, but also him just outright refusing to take jumpers just makes it a lot easier for teams to defend Philadelphia in the half court. They can play off of Simmons, and then which kind of cramps the floor for him as a driver. And if you're passing it to an Embiid, or now if you're passing it to a Horford, if they're playing together, you just double off of Ben Simmons, and if he isn't going to shoot out there, you can kind of reconfigure your rotations behind the double team. You can still leave Ben Simmons alone and shut down the other options, and it just kind of leaves you out to dry. So I think Ben Simmons has to find a way to impact basketball in a half-court setting offensively for Philadelphia to really be a serious title contender. I think Brett Brown moving him to power forward this year is going to help. That's also going to depend on how well Shake Milton plays. He's going to have the pull-up jumper to really make that work. But they do have good chemistry already in pick and roll. So we just have to see if that continues to work, and also if Ben is going to be any kind of willing to take take jumpers, specifically three-pointers, in high-leverage situations. He's taken a couple of threes in the scrimmages so far. It's encouraging. He's made a corner three. He's made a couple of them, actually. So if he keeps that up, I'm not sure if teams are going to give him respect out there still. It takes a couple of years to change the reputation when it comes to perimeter shooting. Your reputation really matters more than your percentages there, and he's going to need a lot more volume and a lot more volume in general before that really becomes a thing. But if he can keep defenses honest, that's going to change the entire landscape for them.
I think great points all around there, and I think from my standpoint, it really comes down to almost what you were saying earlier with Giannis, where Giannis is that guy, and I think Embiid needs to be that guy, and then the supporting cast, Simmons and Middleton and guys like that, they have to figure out ways where they can be consistent, on a regular basis. But I think for me, Embiid has played well and great points in terms of his impact, especially on the defensive side for Philadelphia. But he's played well, but I don't know if he's played at MVP level well. I think when it comes to playoffs, and that's why I think I kind of pointed him out too. But a lot of that is, hey, he's a big man who needs the ball in his hands to be effective, especially offensively. He's not going to dribble it up himself off a rebound and then initiate offense. They have to find a way to get him the ball. But more in Philadelphia a little bit later on. Let's transition this conversation now to the race for 8. Right now, it is basically between Orlando, Brooklyn, and Washington. Guys, kind of where do you see this potentially shaking out? Brooklyn is decimated and basically have guys like me and you running around out there right now. Shouts to Jamal Crawford getting into the bubble. I think Beasley's going to be out. He's got suspension. He's got the COVID thing, so I don't know if he's even going to enter the bubble at all. But Brooklyn's got a lot of questions that they're dealing with. Orlando seems to be pretty stable, getting some of their guys back and healthy. In Washington, obviously with Bertans and Beal out, what is your outlook on how this race for 8 is ultimately going to shake out?
I would anticipate that it's probably going to stay stopped. If anything, Orlando's probably going to pass Brooklyn for 7. But as you mentioned, Brooklyn is decimated, but they do still have some intriguing young pieces in Karis LeVert. Joe Harris is still there. Jared Allen's still there. They still have guys at least. It's just a matter of actually getting them in the bubble. But there is still, even with the guys they have in the bubble right now, there's still some talent. And they basically just have to not go 0-8 to really to not be in danger against Washington. With Washington already being a bad team, they're also missing their 2 best players. And not only are they their 2 best players, they're the 2 best scorers. They're also their 2 best shooters. I just don't see a path for Washington getting in there. Like, it would probably take a miracle for them to force the play in. And then from there, I just don't see it. Because they would need they do have some shooters like a Garrison Matthews that people probably haven't heard of. But even if they get hot, they just can't defend anyone. So even if it comes to a play-in situation, I would still take Brooklyn there. So I would anticipate it's probably going to be Orlando and then Brooklyn 48 seed, and then with Washington kind of hanging out.
I am curious, though, Nekias, Rui Hachimura is expected to play, and that was like, a really positive I want to say sign from the organization. Like, they were really happy that he has opted to, continue in this restart, be it all things considered that he is a Japanese basketball player and could have easily decided to just, go back home and wait till everything tampers down with the COVID-19 situation. Mm-hmm. So if you're the NBA, knowing that he is going to basically be the best player representing the Washington Wizards, how do you play that up? Because, listen, I like Hachimura's game, and I think that this is a great opportunity if you are a Washington Wizards fan to see him get a little bit of shine that won't be overshadowed by Bradley Beal, because you really need to start recognizing, yes, this is Bradley Beal's team, but it just because it's Bradley Beal's team does that mean that come next season that you have an absolute idea about what kind of team is surrounding Bradley Beal. And you want as much exposure as possible on the upside and potential of what the rest of your roster has to offer. And you can also put a little bit of a positive spotlight on Scott Brooks for a change. The guy has been taking hits since 2012, okay? And it's about time we actually start acknowledging when coaches do have a positive impact on teams that don't historically have a good trend as far as collecting wins in an NBA league. And so I think that this is just great opportunity, no matter what happens here, that as long as Scott Brooks shows that he is still a good coach that can move that ball forward when they do have their full roster next year, and Hachimura comes out and plays some good lights out basketball, regardless of the outcome, I think it's a win for the Washington Wizards.
I would agree with that. I do think there probably needs to be a push. I think in general, the NBA needs to do a better job of pushing young guys, or just pushing young guys that aren't super glamorous. Because, I mean, pushing Zion is easy. Pushing Ja Morant is easy. And they kind of had to be nuts to do that, considering that Memphis kind of came out of nowhere. But I think this is where we kind of get into how does the NBA market its product. It's a star-driven league, but it's also important to make sure that people know who all the stars are. So there isn't a reason for a guy – it shouldn't be a reason for Nikola Jokic to still not be well-known in, like, casual circles and things like that. So I feel like there should be a push. Like Rui Hachimura, he does have the international connection going for him, and that brings a lot of extra eyes on Washington in general. And he is an intriguing young prospect. I'm a lot lower on him than others on this pod, apparently, but that's fine.
We could have that conversation in another time too, my friend. Okay.
But no, in general, I do think there just needs to be more of a push to kind of the stars matter the most, but the stars aren't the only ones that matter. And I think that's how you grow the product. The people need to know who these players are. So then, if Rui does take a leap and become a 21-8 guy, it shouldn't take an extra 2 years before people know that he's good, or for Washington to kind of go into a 4-5 matchup somehow as like a surprise team and upset someone, and then it's like, oh wait, Washington has good players. I think it's important to do the work early. It just fosters a smarter NBA community.
Well, I can agree with you on that wholeheartedly. That I can definitely agree with you. We'll debate Hachimura's ascension on your totem pole of talent another time.
So what I want to do here is kind of jump into even talk the next portion of what we want to discuss, and even going away from the race for 8 a little bit. But Orlando's situation, I think, perfectly said. We definitely agree with that. We were on another show recently and talked about Orlando should pretty much just drop out of the runnings if they cannot get to the 7th seed, and past Brooklyn with the way Brooklyn's roster has been kind of decimated. But let's talk about Orlando's chances in general. My take on the NBA restart, specifically in the Eastern Conference, are going to be teams that have strong defensive principles, and teams that are well-conditioned will probably at least get out to a decent start. Now, how that ends up shaking out in the playoffs may be a little bit different. But what is your take, Nekias, on kind of Orlando and their ability to, again, get that 7 seed and be competitive potentially, in a playoff series, with what would potentially be Toronto. Not say that they're going to win that series, but, would they get just kind of mollywopped and, swept out of there? Or because of their defense, they think they have a chance to maybe steal a couple games? And I know it's projecting a little bit far out, but just in general, your thoughts on Orlando Magic?
I do think they are one of the better coached teams in the league. Steve Clifford is fantastic, especially on the defensive end. They are going to muck the game up. And I think in a situation like this, where there's been such a long layoff, I think any team that can produce defensively and really make things ugly for the others is going to have more than a puncher's chance in game. So I do give Orlando a little bit of a shot there, but ultimately they're still a bit of a mess offensively. Nikola Vucevic is good. Evan Fournier is pretty good. Beyond that, you're looking at relying on shots from DJ Augustine. Markelle Fultz hasn't played in a scrimmage yet. I'm not sure what is going on there. It seems more precautionary than anything, but even then, he still has his questions in the half court. So I think that's where you look at a matchup against Toronto or a matchup against Boston, and you say, okay, they just don't have the horses for this. And if Jonathan Isaac isn't there, then it's all kind of a wash anyway. Aaron Gordon is still trying to find his way as a shot creator. He just needs a new situation, but I feel like that's an entirely different conversation with him. But yeah, I just don't trust the Magic enough offensively to really make noise. I think their best shot would be Boston moving up 2, because then you can at least kind of talk yourself into Nikola Vucevic having his way against Boston's good but slightly undersized big men. And Orlando at least has the size on the wings, especially if Isaac comes back, to really bother Boston's wings. And then you can kind of make a series ugly there, but they just don't have enough creation to really make noise, I don't think.
Nekias, it's interesting because the way that I'm looking at this is that if you're the Orlando Magic, the initial start to your season, your restart to your season, I think is absolutely critical, because I think that they can actually, snatch a few wins out there, because some of the teams that they will be playing against may be very slow before they start picking things up and becoming a reflection of who they've been over the course of the year, which can play a role as far as determining the seedings for them go, right? And to your point, if you already have a team that has mastered the way of mucking it up, right? Those ugly games in the beginning can turn to W's, right? While teams are still trying to find their offensive footing. Now, the only question is can a team like the Orlando Magic figure out a way to score enough points through the course of this restart, which I don't even think is realistic for them. But I think that if they are trying to be serious about competing, I think it will behoove them for them to really lock it down from a defensive side, keep the game at a snail's pace almost, and to your point, make it about as ugly as possible. And I think that they will find themselves in contention and probably pull off a couple of upsets, through the early stages of the schedule. And then maybe they might fall into some luck of, again, as a matchup situation for them in the playoffs that could actually allow them to try to extend their stay in their own home city.
I can see that. I would imagine they also hopeful. They also hope so. But it's tough to get excited about the offense with Aaron Gordon taking a bunch of step back mid-range jumpers and trying to do a little bit too much. They just don't have a real pull-up threat outside of DJ Augustine and Evan Fournier. And if those are your two best pull-up threats, it just gets a little funky. I can't get there. I just can't get there. They can very much hold an opposing offense well below their averages, but if they can't match it themselves, I don't know how much it matters.
Which is why I think the loss of the Brooklyn Nets, as far as most of their roster and Kenny Atkinson, we're not going to talk about this at any kind of length, but I'm going to bring this up. I think that the loss of Kenny Atkinson under these circumstances is gonna come home to roost for the Brooklyn Nets, because no matter what happens to this team, we're not questioning whether or not they would have been good enough to get to an Eastern Conference Finals or anything. But what we're talking about here is optics and representation. And to me, I think that this team, under these circumstances, having a coach like Kenny Atkinson would be a far better sense of representation for what they've done and accomplished up to this point in the season than now seeing what we're probably going to have happen to this team when they do enter the bubble and the games actually begin.
I would say my counter to that would be, I think the absence of like 60% of their roster is probably a bigger deal than missing out on not having Kenny Atkinson there, especially since he seems to clash a little bit with the stars that they brought in. So it's kind of like he instilled this great culture. He cultivated all these young guys. He got them to play a more modern style. They've been up there in three-point rate. They try to take away three-pointers as well. Done all the right things, and that is what made Brooklyn attractive enough to get a guy like Kevin Durant, to get a guy like Kyrie Irving, and DeAndre Jordan was a package deal for God knows why. But then he isn't there because he doesn't really vibe with them. So, it's just kind of unfortunate in that regard. But also, if Kenny Atkinson isn't there, I think having Jacques Vaughn there is fine. A, he's good with player development, player relationships. B, I'm not sure how much this matters, so I'm not sure how much people collectively care about the Nets. But, having another black coach in the bubble is fine, I feel.
It's a good point.
It's
a good point. Yeah, definitely. I feel where you're coming from on that, and I can definitely see what you mean in that regards. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I don't. I think whatever expectations people had for the Nets have kind of gone out the window with everyone catching COVID or being hurt. So I don't think there's real room for disappointment. Now, how much upside they have is going to depend on how healthy they are. But I feel like I think Brooklyn more than any other team is just kind of in purgatory, I feel, in terms of this particular tournament. Because, I mean, the only real recognizable guy there at this point, I mean, Spencer Dinwiddie, he had his thing with COVID, so I'm not sure if he's going to join the bubble or not. And that leaves Karis LeVert, and I feel like he's going to be an important piece this year to see how good he is. And depending on how good he is, he's either going to kind of settle in as their third initiator behind Durant and Irving, or he's going to be the trade chip that kind of gets them the third piece that can really make them dangerous next year and years to come.
So I'm going to transition yet again here, Nekias, and I think, when it comes to Brooklyn and Orlando and Washington or whatever, we all agree that they're not contenders. Like, they have no chance of doing anything really, no matter what happens. They might be competitive, they might be gritty, but they have no get out of the Eastern Conference. You've already kind of let your thoughts be known on where Milwaukee stands and Giannis, and kind of like they should probably be the prohibitive favorites there. But we need to go to the middle of the pack, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Of the teams, Toronto, Boston, Philadelphia, and Indiana, Miami, which of those teams do you feel has the most capability of making a seriously deep run in the Eastern Conference?
My guess there would probably be, I would slightly lean towards the Boston Celtics, just because they have so much wing talent. They have so much two-way talent in general. And I feel like with Jason Tatum, we saw him making the leap right as the season was kind of ending. Jaylen Brown has had an all-star caliber season, didn't make the team this year, but he was certainly up there. Gordon Hayward on a per-possession basis is basically the guy he was in Utah, which is a scary thing to think about. He's basically their fourth option at this point. They've gotten some good things from Daniel Tice in the middle. Robert Williams has shown some flashes. Marcus Smart has been the best defensive guard in basketball this year. And they're obviously well coached. Brad Stevens is the top 5 coach in the league, I feel. So they have enough depth. Well, I think they have enough wing depth specifically. I feel like they'd probably add an initiator short off the bench. But depending on how they stagger those lineups, it might not matter if they're going to have two of Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, or Gordon Hayward on the floor at all times. And I think that kind of alleviates that issue. But they're deep. They're well coached. They shoot well. They defend the three-point line very well. They've been a top 3 defense on 3 since Brad Stevens has been there, basically. So I think they have all the stuff to make an Eastern Conference Finals run and possibly beat Milwaukee if they match up in the Eastern Conference Finals, just because they have so many wing scorers.
Nekias Duncan joining us here on the baseline. Be sure to catch him on his awesome Twitter handle at Nekias NBA, which, by the way, you have listed as Karen's in Paris. So clever. Totally loving it, man. Totally loving it. I completely agree with you with everything that you're saying with regards to the Boston Celtics. I'm a little surprised because now I'm really curious as to why you have Boston ahead of Miami. Is the Heat, is it more of of being a pipe dream? I feel like there's a level of motivation here. Maybe I'm just being a little bit more of a simpleton, and I'm taking nothing away from your point regarding this. This essentially should be, or could be, let me use the word could be Jason Tatum's and Jaylen Brown's time. But I believe that there is poetic justice in the air for a guy like Jimmy Butler. And there is just opportunity here where he could basically get it 2 for 1, right? One, running through the Philadelphia 76ers, of whom he obviously, left hanging on I-95 on the side road after last season. And, with the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers with the Milwaukee Bucks, because part of the point is Jimmy Butler the kind of guy to lead a team like the Miami Heat? And he's had a couple opportunities with previous teams. this could be his opportunity. This could be his NBA moment. This could be his Kawhi moment, so to speak. And we could really be talking about how serious a move this could be to validate the Miami Heat doing what they've done to get him to come to Miami.
I think that's a valid point about Jimmy Butler. Especially the narrative would be fantastic, especially if he gets through Philly first. Which, with Indiana basically being without two of their best three players at this point, they could slide to 6, and that could set up a 4-5 matchup with Miami and Philadelphia in the first round. So that's the thing that could happen. I think Jimmy Butler and the Miami Heat in general are good enough to beat Philly in the series. I would say that they should probably be slightly favored in that series as of now, and that would obviously set up a second round matchup with Milwaukee, which that can kind of go either way with either of those teams, really. But I think my lack of faith, at least compared to Boston, comes on the defensive end. Miami has been an average defensive team in terms of defensive rating all year long. They've allowed, I want to say, the 29th most threes in the league this year. And like a part of that is scheme, because they play a traditional drop coverage scheme. But also they have been awful at the point of attack. And I think that's what's made their defense slip this year. Before the year, I thought Miami was going to fight for a top 3 or top 4 seed this year, because I anticipated, with the addition of Jimmy Butler, him, Bam Adebayo, Justice Winslow at the time, having those guys on the wing, I thought Miami was going to be an elite defense. And because they had struggled to score so much offensively, I figured, well, Jimmy Butler isn't a great shooter. The floor can kind of be a little cramped. So I was anticipating Miami was going to be like about 15th, 16th, somewhere in there in offense. And that script has completely flipped this year. They have been an elite offense, and the defense has been out of sorts all year because they haven't been able to stop dribble penetration. So they ran more zone possessions than won the NBA this year. Since they traded for Andre Iguodala and Jay Crowder and Solomon Hill, they switched at a top 5 rate since the trade deadline. They're trying to do anything they can to kind of keep the ball in front. And I don't know if you caught the scrimmage with Miami against Utah last night, but it was pretty bad. Donovan Mitchell was able to get into the lane whenever he wanted to. He just couldn't make a shot, but he consistently penetrated the lane. Mike Conley consistently penetrated the lane. Jordan Clarkson came off the bench, got to the lane with ease. Rudy Gobert started the game, I believe, 9 of 9 from the field, and all 9 of those buckets were dunks. And 8 of those came after dribble penetration, and the other dunk was off an offensive rebound after dribble penetration. So that's what Miami's been dealing with all year. They have been an elite offense, headlined by their shooting. They've been the best three-point shooting team in the league this year. So I think that's always going to keep them in games. But they have struggled specifically against Boston because they just don't have the horses on the wing to defend all of them. You can throw a guy like Jimmy on Jason Tatum, or you can throw Jimmy on Jaylen Brown and have Bam take the Tatum assignment because of how versatile he is on the perimeter. But that still leaves Hayward. We already talked about Kemba Walker, who would be the guy penetrating from up top in those high pick and rolls all the time. Kendrick Nunn can't guard him. Goran Dragic surely can't guard him. So it just kind of goes into those same issues. And I have not seen an answer from Miami defensively to feel confident in them being, at least in terms of picking them versus Boston or Toronto. I just haven't seen enough defensively to do that.
So great points to think on when it comes to the Miami Heat, and obviously scrimmages are scrimmages, but definitely you can glean some stuff from out of that. And obviously Adebayo still hasn't played, and he obviously can help at least try to rim protect if with that porous perimeter defense can try to erase some things. Not necessarily as a big shot blocker, but as a deterrent and trying to get in the way of guys coming into the lane. Well, let's talk a little bit about Toronto. You just mentioned them here a little bit as well too, as a defending champ, second in the Eastern Conference. Pretty secure in that space. Like again, you alluded to, could potentially drop to 3, but not probably as likely in general. What kind of puncher's chance do you give the Raptors? With their defensive principles, they have a lot of depth, and Nick Nurse doing almost kind of a Popovich style, just plug and play. Anybody he puts out there goes out there and gets great minutes, whether that's Boucher, whether that's Davis, it doesn't matter. Guys go out there and produce for the Toronto Raptors. Where do you have them this shaking out of the Eastern Conference?
I think if Milwaukee is the prohibitive favorite, then I would probably have Boston 2. Since Toronto and Boston occupy those 2-3 slots, they would be slotted to match up in the second round. So I think they would, by default, Toronto would have to be 3 there. We talk about the Celtics being well coached. Nick Nurse has probably done the best coaching job this year. Would not be a hot take to call him the best coach of basketball right now. But even beyond that, Kyle Lowry is fantastic. Pascal Siakam is fantastic. Honestly, it would probably be easier to name the players that aren't fantastic on the Raptors at this point. They are just a super deep group. Pascal Siakam is taking the lead as a number one option. They've just gotten contributions from everywhere. They're versatile. They can throw a bunch of different looks defensively. I talked about Miami having to kind of alter their drop coverage and kind of do more zone and stuff like that. Toronto has done, I feel like they've literally done everything. Like we saw the Bucks and won the last year's finals. They'll run a 2-3 zone. They'll run a 3-2 zone. They'll go man-to-man. They'll blitz pick and roll. They'll drop under. They'll switch them. They'll do whatever. Nick Nurse is not afraid to experiment with his guys. And to their credit, they're all long, they're all rangy, they're all incredibly smart, so they can pull off all these coverages. With them, I feel like the biggest question mark is late game half court scoring. They've kind of done it by committee, although Pascal Siakam has very quietly been a really good clutch scorer, averaging north of 42 points per 100 clutch possessions this year, which is a huge increase from where he was last year. Obviously, that comes with volume. But he's also done it at a pretty efficient rate. He would be the guy that they would lean on since he's basically a walking mismatch. But he does have some things to improve on in terms of decision-making. He has gotten a lot stronger since he's entered the league, but he can still get bodied a little bit. And he's already a herky-jerky driver, so that can kind of lead to some awkward flips if he doesn't get the call. So I do think the drop from Kawhi to Pascal overall, it's big, but it's not huge. But in terms of who you trust in a late-game situation, Kawhi is the best three-level scorer in basketball with Kevin Durant injured. And Pascal isn't that. So I think that could be an issue come playoff time. But Toronto is really good. It wouldn't surprise me to see them because Eastern Conference run either.
So I want to follow up on something real quick on that, Nekias. Doesn't that, to your point, the fact that this is a team that's really willing to do any and everything, and that the fact that they throw out all of these multiple looks at you, doesn't that make this team just as equally dangerous during this type of restart because there is so much flexibility? Who do you see likely to get the most shine for the Raptors through this restart?
I think there are two answers to that question. I would say first, more to what you just described, I think the answer is going to be OG. I think he's their best young wing prospect. He's already one of the best defenders in basketball. He's a sneaky good cutter. He is very quietly improving his drive game, and that's going to be huge for him. But also, the shot has been there. He's shooting over 38% from three, and that was the big question mark coming out of college for him. That is health, which is why he kind of slid out of the lottery. But he has been he's the real wild card because he is the guy that if they want to save Pascal in a potential series against Milwaukee, they can throw OG on Giannis, and they're obviously going to still build their wall. But OG is the guy that can get into Giannis's chest and bother him. He still has the lift to contest at the rim. Like he's the kind of guy that can defend those elite wings. So if they see Boston, OG's going to get the Tatum assignment, and he's not going to need help. Tatum may still win those battles, but he's going to have to work for all of it. So I think from that perspective, I think OG's going to be the guy that say, oh, wait, Toronto might have another one in the wing. Because Pascal Siakam kind of came out of nowhere. And I don't want to say that OG's going to be a 23-point scorer or anything like Pascal turned into, but I think he's going to be the guy that you look and say, okay, Toronto has something here. From a less traditional standpoint, I think the answer is going to be Marc Gasol, because as much as Toronto's half-court offense has struggled in comparison to last year, not having Marc Gasol kind of facilitate from the elbows, kind of stretch out opposing bigs from the three-point line, especially against a team like Miami that runs a drop coverage and that leaves those stretch bigs open, not having a guy like Marc Gasol there really hurts, because the passing drop from him to Serge Ibaka it's huge. And Serge has been good this year, too, one of the many good players for Toronto this season. But Marc Gasol just brings an element of playmaking from the high post that really puts a strain on opposing defenses. And with Toronto not having a Kawhi-like number one, they need to win on all the margins that they can. And Marc Gasol is the guy that helps them do that. So I feel like if Toronto makes a run to the Eastern Conference Finals or deeper, it's going to be because Marc Gasol helps solidify that half-court offense. So he's going to get shine. And he's a free agent coming up this year. So that's going to put him in position to either get a big 1 or 2 year payday from Toronto or go elsewhere for a team that feels like they're a piece away.
There's a couple of guys who are going to be free agents on Toronto, and even with Gasol, you've seen him coming back super slimmed down as well too. How do you think that's going to play into his ability? Because a lot of times we don't know. Again, we're not talking about the West today, but Jokic also slimmed down, Harden slimmed down, things of that nature. But for big guys, a lot of times that weight, so to speak, helps him on the post. But Gasol is not necessarily a traditional post player. How do you see that shaking out for him? Just you think it's going to be a better look for Toronto in general with him being a little bit more slim?
I think it's going to be a good thing because you remember this would be slim down number 2 for Gasol.
Yeah.
Because when he was in Memphis, what made him jump from a 13-8 guy to a 17-9 guy is when he slimmed down in Memphis. And I think a lot of, I don't want to say the weight gain, but him not being in peak condition is because he's basically missed half the year.
Messing with too injury. Much of that hormone, that Spanish hormone, man. I'm telling you, in the offseason, he's got to lay off of that stuff, man.
You're right. But, yeah, I think him slipping down is more of him getting back to his peak shape more so than him making, like, a drastic change like he did in Memphis. So I do think with him being slimmed down, that should probably scare other teams. Because, last year, he was as good as Joel Embiid or as impactful as Joel Embiid was. Marc Gasol did a fantastic job defending him last year. Marc Gasol did a good job against Brook Lopez last year, kind of operating the same role or similar roles. Brook Lopez was more force stretcher than playmaker from the high post, but he was a guy that could stonewall those post-ups whenever Milwaukee did go to that well. So I think having Marc Gasol is going to be able to defend pick and rolls a little bit better, which already isn't an issue when you have a guy like Kyle Lowry or Fred VanVleet at the point of attack. But also, I think it's going to allow him to play longer, and they're going to need all the help they can get offensively in the half court.
Nekias Duncan joining us here on the Baseline NBA podcast as we get into our Eastern Conference discussions of the restart that will be taking place this week. Be sure to get him on Twitter at Nekias NBA. So we'd be remiss before we start getting into our predictions to talk a little bit about the Indiana Pacers. I feel like we've probably ran the gamut in discussing every single team conceivably, but we didn't really dig much into the Indiana Pacers. And obviously a lot of the focus is on, how well can the Pacers play, knowing that they have Oladipo. But do they really have Oladipo? And what I mean by that is he still is coming off of the injury. And even this time off, while I'm sure that was a positive, I don't know how much of a positive that's going to be as an attribute to his game. And what can Nate McMillan expect Oladipo to contribute in such a truncated period for this team, for this squad, that can help us elevate them in the conversation that they has as much opportunity and chance to make a run in this restart as anybody else?
I think the big thing there is hoping that Oladipo has his pull-up jumper going, because he is still trying to regain the burst that made him a 20-plus point per game scorer. So I think him having that jumper kind of as a fail-safe is going to be huge for him as he still kind of gets his legs under him. And that's under the assumption that he decides to opt in. Because playing in the scrimmages, that's fine. But, he still has the ability to opt out if he doesn't feel comfortable because of his health or because he doesn't want to risk getting hurt with a contract year coming up next year, or he's evaluating what Indiana looks like as a team, especially with Domantas Sabonis. Now he's out of the bubble with his foot injury. So he may look at that and say, hey, if the best we can do here is make it to the second round, if we hang in the 4 or 5 bracket, if the best we can do is beat Miami and then get swept by Milwaukee, then I'm not sure if I want to do that versus play with my team, kind of see where I'm at right now in my recovery, and then go back home, which is Miami for him, funny enough, and continue training and try to have a contract year.
I think with Indiana, those are it all makes sense. There were some rumors coming into the bubble that they weren't all that enamored about going to begin with, because they just really didn't feel like they had much of a shot to do much. And that was when Oladipo originally said he wasn't going to play, but he's gone there now, at least trying to test it out. But with Sabonis going down, it does seem kind of, almost fruitless. There's nothing to gain for Victor in this situation because he's their guy. they're going to pay him. And so he doesn't have anything to prove, I think, because Indiana is not traditionally a great place to that. So if they can retain his bird rights and give him the, whatever kind of what he wants, I think he doesn't have to prove anything to the Pacers organization or to their fans in that regard itself too. So close this thing out, brother. I really do appreciate the time that you spent with us here, man. Want to kind of predict kind of how you see this all shaking out? We've obviously intimated a little bit to how we think some things may go, but first and foremost, who you see coming out? Do you see any major upsets happening within the playoff rankings once they start off?
In terms of upsets, just because they are a lower seeded team, I would keep an eye on Houston. I think the time off is going to help them, especially the front court, which is now PJ Tucker and Robert Covington. Undersized, banging with a bunch of centers. They may see Nikola Jokic in the first round. We'll have to see. But I do think they play such a drastically different style of basketball from everybody else in the league. They're probably the highest variance team in the league because of their threes, with as small as they play and as much as they stretch the floor out, just in terms of positioning, they're starting Eric Gordon over Daniel House. Eric Gordon spots up behind the hash. When James Harden doesn't have the ball, he's basically 35 feet from the basket. PJ Tucker and Robert Covington are always in the corners. That just gives a bunch of space for Russell Westbrook to drive. And you can flip that if James Harden has the ball. So they're going to be able to spread teams out in a way that no other team can. And if their threes are falling, they can beat anyone. Now, what the war of attrition is going to be like banging with bigger bodies for a 7-game series is going to be, I don't know. But they have that game-to-game variance to beat anyone. So I think if anyone's going to be an upset team, it's going to be Houston. In terms of my prediction, I'm kind of torn. Before the year, it was Philly. But then things just kind of blew up in the locker room, and they just could not win away from home. There were some odd things with Ben Simmons. There were some odd things with Brett Brown. There was just a lot going on. Al Horford has drastically underperformed his contract. It's just been weird with Philly. So I've kind of lost faith in them. I would say they probably have the second highest variance behind Houston. But I would probably lean the Clippers at this point. I think ultimately we see a Clippers-Bucks finals, and I think the Clippers get that done in 7.
Tough talk from our guy here, Nekias, man. The Clippers and Milwaukee, a finals that I think a lot of people would enjoy seeing. Kawhi going up against Giannis, in an NBA finals. So love that conversation, though, especially with Houston. On my side, although we'll get to the West here a little bit too. I'm very concerned, about them. But sticking to the Eastern Conference, I'm going to go with your team as a team that could potentially upset teams and make it at least all the way to the Eastern Conference, and that's Miami. While I do recognize their defensive deficiencies, their ability, they've shot the 3 ball a lot better than I would have expected them to. And then I just think some guys have matured. Obviously, the production they've got out of Nunn, the most improved year that we're getting out of Bam Adebayo, I think they have probably the most upset potential in the Eastern Conference, to make a very, very deep run. Not saying that they can get to the finals per se, but they maybe the Eastern Conference final. That would be my team that probably has the most dark horse potential in the East. Cal, what you got?
Well, to me, I think that everything is leading up to a rematch of last year's Eastern Conference Finals between the Toronto Raptors and the Milwaukee Bucks, where if that is the case, I think that the Milwaukee Bucks will find a path forward, and they will finally represent, the Eastern Conference in the NBA Finals. My dark horse is going to be the Boston Celtics. I see that if the matchup comes out where the Celtics take on the Toronto Raptors in the semifinals, the Celtics have an insider's chance. I just like, the versatility offensively, and they've got guys that can go get buckets, and they've been doing this now for a few years, where even though I am so sold on the Toronto Raptors and their ability to will their way into wins, and they'll either do it ugly or they'll do it fantastically. I just wonder if whether or not this is that time where we're seeing the underdog teams like the Bucks and teams like the Celtics finally bully their way into the conversations of us legitimately taking them serious, no matter who's coming out of the Western Conference. So I listen, I would love to see the Miami Heat continue this Cinderella story, but I think that they're going to fall a little bit short. I don't have as much confidence, as to Nekias' point, defensively with them as I would with, say, the Celtics or with the Raptors. And I think that that's going to be key as, you start veering into, deep into the playoff runs. Those teams that seem to have it, that can hold it together, the reliable players, the role players, that all points in the direction of really the top 3 teams in the Eastern Conference at this point, with the Miami Heat and the Philadelphia 76ers as the outliers. It depends what leap both of those teams' top players are going to take to help elevate their team. And I just think it's too big a leap under these circumstances in this sort of time frame.
So, Nekias, see that you jumped off the Philly bandwagon here a little bit, and that's fine. And I understand that. I was on that same plane a little bit. Let's close this one out here too. Do you see any path where they can potentially, live up to the proverbial potential? And if not, do they end up having to blow it all up, as many people are alluding to?
I do think the path is still there. The talent still remains. Again, with Ben Simmons moving to the 4, it's going to depend on what he looks like as a roller, which in the small sample that we have is good. It's also going to depend on how well Joel Embiid spaces the floor. If Philly does go 1-4 pick and roll or 2-4 pick and roll with Josh Richardson or whatever. And it's also going to depend on how reliable of a decision maker is Shake Milton. Late second round pick. He does have some playmaking chops. Does have a little bit of pull-up shooting equity. He has to make those shots. If he can keep defenses honest with the pull-up, that's going to open up the floor for everyone. And if you have a guy like Al Horford anchoring the second unit for you, if he's playing with one of Joel Embiid or Ben Simmons, then that becomes a lot more viable. And then Philly can just overwhelm you with size all the time. So the path is still there for them to make it. There are just a lot of big question marks. And it's kind of hard to have faith in them to answer all those questions, especially in a circumstance like this.
Makes perfect sense to me. So last thought on this whole thing. As always, Nekias, we appreciate everything that you've been able to do for us. Tell the people where they can find you and what you have next coming up, with all the very many outlets that you represent.
Well, you can find me at the most original name on Twitter, Nekias NBA, Nekias NBA. I'm going to have a Heat piece dropping this week for the 5 Reasons Sports Network. I may have some WNBA words coming soon, so keep an eye out for that. With the season starting, I've been doing some video breakdowns on some of the early games. Actually have the Connecticut Sun Minnesota Olympics game on my TV right now. It's going down to the wire, so turn your TVs to ESPN. But other than that, I'm just tweeting about a bunch of basketball, man.
Well, don't be that Karen. don't be that NBA Karen, Nekias. We need you, man. We need you. What a way for us to kickstart, this 2-part series per se, Shaw, of covering the NBA restart and having our man Nekias Duncan jumping on board and just really breaking it down. And, he brought up so many excellent points that it's kind of reinvigorated my senses of enthusiasm to watch how these Eastern Conference teams are going to be getting at each other, not just to determine seeding, but eventually to be playing, to figure out who's going to be repping the East for the finals, right? Like, I really think that people were going to be sleeping on the Eastern Conference. Not a question of whether or not the Milwaukee Bucks should or shouldn't dominate, but there's so many things that we kind of learned from what Nekias was telling us that I think should really help people have a better appreciation for why we need both sides to be up and step their game up for the competitive throws for this thing to work.
Yeah, Nekias just sees the game in a way that a lot of people don't. He's very analytical. He understands how plays are developed and ran, tendencies of offenses and defenses, coaches, et cetera, and most people are casual fans, so to speak, and that's fine. But he sees it in a way that, again, that can really is consumable for casual fans to understand. And he's just a likable dude. Just a good dude who has his proverbial ish together, and that's why he's on so many outlets. So it's great that we were able to bring him back on our show for an important episode, if you will, here, especially with the Eastern Conference. So much going on in this conference in general, as there are in both. But they're being overlooked. You know what I mean? All the focus is on the two LA teams out on the Western Conference. But I think Milwaukee, Boston, Toronto, Philly, Miami, all these teams, they have legitimate opportunities to make a run at this thing. And it should be a lot of fun no matter what ends up happening.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think in some respects, while this pandemic has obviously rattled our confidence about whether or not we're going to be able to see this thing through fully, I do think that this has allowed us to kind of revisit and relook at within each of these teams, what's at stake for them, right? And I think then that helps heighten our desire to see these guys out there. I didn't realize it, you know what I'm saying? Because again, I'm coming from a space where I just believe there's so much going on outside. And that if you are an NBA player that's been living in that space outside, to now enter some confined space, assuming that you're going to tune everything out or the NBA is going to tune all of that stuff out for you, I think is foolhardy. But when you also look at the level, the levels of and complex storylines that emerge, even in this stopgap period where there was no NBA basketball, now I think that there's somewhere of a balance. And I think that, to me, provides a little bit of encouragement and, dare I say, a level of optimism in wanting to see the games being played. It doesn't mean that I'm all on board with it. I'm just saying that now that I can see that there's so many complex layers to the reasons why these guys have to play in this season, it's hard pressed for me not wanting to see this happen. Whether I wanted to see it happen now or a month from now, I think is all semantics. But in the end, it's just encouraging to see that these teams truly do have something to play for, and they're trying to best position themselves to do it and do it with all commitment involved.
One of the things that we haven't discussed, and it's just in general, kind of talking about this restart, is the amount of players that are donating their salaries, to causes that impact social justice, and then some even, the health crisis, obviously with COVID-19 as well too. So I think the NBA is well positioned to do kind of as best as it can. But Nekias made some great points, to say, like, listen, they're doing a little bit, but they're not doing everything. And, they're still kind of doing it with some level of restriction, especially to the players in general. But it's better than most. And while that may not necessarily be good enough, I think it's kind of where we're at. And we have to kind of accept that and understand that, and that the league is still a business for all intents and purposes. Like, it's a business that needs to run, and it's got to figure out ways to make money while still trying to be the most popular sport in the world when it comes to impacting and recognizing the social injustices that are in our society as well too. So they have a tough job. The league itself does, but I think they're doing an acceptable job especially when you compare it to other leagues out there.
Absolutely, man, and very well said. And again, it these little things provide hope that we're making those right decisions, and the reasons for those decisions will balance out obviously the true agenda that's involved here to what Nekias was talking about. We get it. Everybody has got their own reasons, has their own personal agenda for why this needs to happen, but as long as that does not consume and suck the oxygen out of the other things, the other reasons, the other motivations for why these guys are coming out here to play, why this NBA season still needs to happen, and the importance of it. As long as it doesn't do that, I think for a lot of us, we can kind of live with those circumstances, because it will evolve into something more. And as long as what we've all have said collectively, Shaw, the NBA has to be fully behind its efforts to continue to motivate and move the conversation and move the discussion forward. If that is their true intention, and they show in that kind of capacity their ability to do that, I think that whether or not they start now or they start too late or they started early, we won't ding them for that. We will only ding them if they veer off or they didn't stay true to their word on what their intentions were in working with the players in order to accommodate this for the greater good of not just the game being played again, but also using the league and the players having an actual legitimate platform for them to move these causes forward as what they had always been asking from get-go. So I'm hoping all of that plays itself out. Once again, we'd like to thank each and every single one of you guys for hopping on board. This is part 1 of a 2-part series, so be sure to check out the next episode where we will be covering the Western Conference, and we'll have a special guest on board. Our girl Janelle Moore is going to help us break down the West. For the Baseline, Callie, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. You know we do. And we'll catch up with you